And while at Boston, he observed the Battle of Bunker Hill and its aftermath, but he was not engaged. In a letter Greene wrote to his wife Catherine about this time, he said, quote, "It had been happy for me if I could have lived a private life in peace and plenty, enjoying all the happiness that results from a well-tempered society founded on mutual esteem. But the injury done my country and the chains of slavery forging for all posterity calls me forth to defend our common rights and repel the bold invaders of the sons of freedom." Nathaniel Greene was a 3%. Now, Washington thought highly of Greene, and he used him in a number of important posts. By 1780, the Continental Congress had made some pretty awful choices to lead the revolution in the South. They'd started with Robert Howe, and he had lost Savannah, Georgia. Then they chose Benjamin Lincoln, and he lost Charleston. And then they came Gates. He got whipped at Camden, effectively ending the American Southern Army as a fighting force and leaving the way clear for Cornwallis. So when Gates' successor was to be chosen, the Congress decided that they'd done as much damage as they could, and they decided to leave it up to George Washington to pick a commander, and he selected Nathaniel Greene. When Greene accepted the post, he wrote, quote, "I am determined to defend my rights and maintain my freedom or sell my life in the attempt." He also said, "I hope this is the dark part of the night, which is generally just before the dawn." I'm doing a story. I'm sorry. You can explain to them about the law, but I'm doing a historical program. Greene went south to pick up the pieces, splitting his forces in order to force Cornwallis to split his. Shortly afterwards, and contrary to Greene's orders not to engage, Morgan gave him the great victory at Cowpens. Morgan fell back toward Greene, bringing his 800 prisoners from Tarleton's force. Greene fell back toward the Dan River as well, using a special light infantry force under Colonel Otho Williams to screen his retreat. It was a close-run thing, but finally, all of Greene's army was across the Dan and ready to give battle to Cornwallis. Recrossing the Dan, Greene moved up to meet him here at Guilford Courthouse on the 15th of March 1781 on ground that Greene had chosen as favorable to the battle he wanted to fight. Dan Morgan, who was finally crippled by illness, was not here. He had been sent home to convalesce, but his men were here, standing on this battlefield which the old wagoner had done so much to shape. Now, like Morgan at Cowpens, Greene arranged his force in 3 battle lines. Unlike Morgan, Greene was not able to hold his militia to the plan, for they panicked and ran, in part because Greene had placed his lines too far apart, out of supporting distance. But the Continentals fought stoutly, as did the Dragoons under Light Horse Harry Lee, and in the end, Cornwallis had a horse shot from under him. He ordered his guns turned upon his own men, who were mixed up with the Americans and giving way. He turned his guns on his own men, rather than lose the battle. Greene withdrew his army in more or less good order, intending to fight Cornwallis again on other ground of his choosing. After Bunker Hill, Greene had commented, quote, "I wish we could sell them another hill at the same price we did Bunker Hill," close quote. Here at Guilford Courthouse, he did. Greene may have left the field to the British, and thus it was a British tactical victory for Cornwallis, but it was a strategic defeat of the greatest magnitude. The battle had lasted just 90 minutes. But Cornwallis lost over a quarter of his men killed and wounded. A prominent war critic in the British House of Commons exclaimed, "Another such victory will ruin the British Army."
There you go.
Cornwallis withdrew, and then he decided to strike out for the Virginia coast and supplies, where he met George Washington and the French Army and Navy at a place called Yorktown. And on October 19, 1781, well, you know how that turned out. For his part, Greene turned south, maneuvering, failing to bring the British into another decisive battle and losing a few small ones himself. But in the end, the British were driven from the interior of the Carolinas and cooped up in Charleston, where they sat out the rest of the war. As Greene himself said, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." And he also said these lines, "We are soldiers who devote ourselves to arms, not for the invasion of other countries, but for the defense of our own, not for the gratification of our private interests, but for public security. He also said this: permit me then to recommend from the sincerity of my heart, ready at all times to bleed in my country's cause, a declaration of independence, and call upon the world and the great God who governs it to witness the necessity, propriety, and rectitude thereof. I have taken the time to remind you all of the men who fought and bled and died here, to remind you of the original 3%ers. What can we learn from their stories? How can we take what they learned and put it to use today? Dan Morgan was uneducated, even coarse, a drinker and a gambler. Nathaniel Greene was educated, studious, quiet, and humble. Each was a genius. Morgan, the natural tactician and troop leader who saw the essential thing and battled toward it. And Greene, the tactical failure, but the strategic thinker who, as much as any other single man, other than perhaps Washington himself, was responsible for the final victory. Neither had been a professional soldier, yet men followed both willingly because they knew that these leaders loved them, took care of them, and would not spend their lives to no purpose. Each understood the weaknesses of their enemies and was able to exploit them. Neither man wanted war, yet when war came they plunged in, offering their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the altar of their country's liberty. Remember, too, Dan Morgan's tactical innovations of the 3 lines, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, but placed within supporting distance of each other so as to make a formation greater than the sum of its parts. And their enemies, Tarleton and Ferguson, let us not forget what their stories teach us. Unlike Morgan and Greene, who were uncommon representatives of the common man, Tarleton and Ferguson were the representatives of the elite of the British Empire. To use the name of Cotevilla's recent essay in the American Spectator, Tarleton and Ferguson were members of the ruling class, and Morgan and Greene were members of the country class. What is the essence of their stories, these men of the British ruling class? That arrogance and pride, cruelty, and rash aggression are their own rewards. That evil contains the seeds of its own destruction if we few, we 3%ers, are courageous enough to oppose it. And finally, that ruling classes were the same then as they are now.
True.
So here we are today, 230 years later, on the same ground, consecrated with their blood and their sacrifice, fighting the latest battle in the eternal struggle between liberty and tyranny, between good and evil. We are here hoping, as the original 3%ers did, that fighting will not be necessary to secure our liberty and property to our posterity, but fearing that it will be. The candidates here today, and those spread all across the nation, the offspring of the Tea Party movement, they represent the next to last hope for rolling back this tide of collectivism and tyrannical appetite with which we are confronted. And it is an appetite. It is not a principle. They are Morgan's second line of resistance. They are the next to last line of defense. We, the modern 3%ers, are the last line of defense.
True.
This is as the founders intended it. Yet if we are to succeed, we must understand our own and each other's place in the battle line, and we must not be divided with too much space between us so that we cannot successfully support each other and turn back the attack of the enemies of the Constitution. Much is being made in the state-run media this election cycle about candidates like Sharon Angle, who have talked about the potential failure of electoral politics, perhaps leading to, quote, Second Amendment remedies. This plain statement of fact is ridiculed as crazy. Our mutual enemies attack this common sense statement of fact as, quote, extreme, and, quote, crazy.